because it was submitted for the video.
Okay, here.
No?
That's me.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with a bunch of my students and our peer students from our partner clinics. So I want to thank Daphne and Rivi for letting us crash your party today. This is really a treat. So I'm going to transition us from the jus ad bellum to the jus in bello. And I think in starting to think about, well, is there something unique about underground warfare for the law of armed conflict? I thought we could just start with what LOAC seeks to achieve. Let's go back to the basics. So if you're going to describe the law of armed conflict in one sentence, you would probably say it's designed to regulate the conduct of hostilities and protect persons who are not fighting. Well, that obviously holds true whether you're above ground, underground, in the air, on the seas, in outer space, new topic these days. But then we can narrow that down a little bit more to the generally stated purposes of LOAC, to protect civilians. It's obviously not hard to see the fundamental danger that tunnels and underground warfare pose to civilians, particularly when we put those tunnels into an urban or even a town environment. Anytime we take the tunnels away from an open battlefield space. And if you've watched the news for the last, even once in the last 20 years, you know we don't have any open battlefield spaces anymore. So essentially conflict takes place in, around, and under the civilian population now. Then we can think about the second core purpose of LOAC, to minimize unnecessary suffering. This is focused on those who are fighting. Well, this is relevant as well when we think about possible options for how you might destroy, neutralize, or I guess potentially capture a tunnel. This can raise questions. What if, for example, as the example of flooding tunnels with concrete, what if there are fighters in there? Do we have to stop and think, is that a method of warfare that might cause unnecessary suffering? It at least raises these questions. What if you flood it with water? What if you fire an explosive through it? What do you need to think about in that context? And of course, we shouldn't forget that LOAC is also designed to enable effective military operations. And so we want to remember that LOAC doesn't mean there's no hard questions, just means we have to actually think through those hard questions and make sure that we're thinking about the purpose of LOAC is not designed to say, no, you can't fight, but it's actually designed to help achieve operational goals as well. So these same goals and purposes apply whether you're fighting above ground or underground. The law continues to apply. So like with any other quite quote new issue, cyber, space, whatever, and again, we know tunnels are in fact quite ancient, so to the extent something ancient can be new, I assume you have a philosophy department here, so I'll leave that to them. But we can think about what are the pressure points, what are the challenges, what are gaps, etc. So I want to just highlight 4 areas where I think we can think about some interesting questions when we're talking about underground warfare and tunnels. So one is military objectives. Another one is proportionality. Another one is precautions in attack. And a fourth is the defending party's precautions. These are not surprising issues. These are kind of the checkbox as you think about targeting in LOAC. But nonetheless, I want to point out what I think are some interesting questions to think about. The first 3 of these, military objectives, proportionality, and precautions in attack, they essentially raise the ante on what is always a crucial aspect in applying LOAC's targeting rules, and that is information. You need information as you think about any of the pieces of the methodology of LOAC. Ultimately, the critical ingredient in all of those is information. So what happens when what you're looking at, what you're thinking about attacking or neutralizing in some way, is underground? So it's not just that you don't see it within your horizon and you need some reconnaissance tools to get over the horizon to see, but it may actually be hidden from any of the information gathering tools you have other than sending a human being in to look. So our normal means for gathering information, especially in today's world where we have so much technological capability, we tend to look at stuff. We either look at it directly, maybe in the old-fashioned world we use binoculars, now we use ISR, reconnaissance, all different types of tools. Quite difficult when everything that we're looking at is underground. We also gather information from people, but again, now what is the added complication there when we're talking about tunnels? So I think that's one sort of theme that underlies the entire conversation. So if we look at military objectives and we think, okay, how do we apply this definition to tunnels? Do we have to think about anything different, anything interesting? The law defines a military objective as objects that by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action and whose destruction, neutralization, or capture offer a definite and concrete military advantage. So it's not hard to see that a tunnel would fit that definition, but if we break it out a little bit, because lawyers really like elements and factors and tests and criteria and all those things. Let's start with the first idea, right? Is a tunnel automatically military? Can it be a military objective by nature, meaning it's intrinsically or inherently military, like a tank, like a military command and control center? And we can go on and on with that list. I think a tunnel certainly could be, but which tunnels? How do we know that a tunnel is intrinsically military? Is it the tunnel that crosses the border? Right, this came up yesterday in some of the discussions. My instinct would be, yeah, except that we can all create a hypothetical in which somebody has dug the tunnel to cross the border in order to escape a repressive regime. Okay, so that one doesn't seem like it's intrinsically military. That one seems like you want to open the door on your end and be like, come on, let's go. So on the other hand, how do you know? Who do you call up and say, hi, I see you're digging. Want to let me know? Like, what's your plan with this tunnel? It's a little hard to get that information. Can you tell by whatever intelligence gathering means you have, by the way it's being dug, by where it's being dug, by the tools being used, by who's digging it? Can you tell anything about the nature of that tunnel in that manner? I think in general there's a very strong presumption if it goes under the border, you can kind of start there. But otherwise, how else might you think about whether it's intrinsically military? And if it's intrinsically military, you can pretty much consider it a lawful target at any time. Now, you would still have to consider things like proportionality and precautions, but in terms of the identification of target, if it's military by nature, then you're ready to move on. So what happens when we're in an urban area? How do you know which parts of which tunnels are intrinsically military? What about location? Can the location of a tunnel apart from the border make it a military objective? And how, when we think about purpose or use, that's when something is not intrinsically military and the way it's being used or it's intended to be used makes it a military objective. Again, this raises questions of how do we know what the tunnel is being used for, and how do we know when it stops being used for that? Again, we can come up with examples where, sure, we would have information that helps us know, fine. But it is perhaps somewhat or a lot trickier than things we can see more easily. I think another question about identifying the military objective comes up when we think about the legal requirement that we don't lump together lots of things into one military objective. We don't look at a town and just say, well, one of those buildings is an enemy headquarters, so let's just hit them all. Because that way we make sure we get it, right? We can't create one military objective out of a town or a particular area. Well, how do we take that concept and put it underground? How do we know when there's many tunnels, how do we know if we need to separate them, how we would separate them? Can we think about just the tunnel itself? Or is it inseparable from what's above it? If a tunnel is dug from a structure above ground, and there's lots and lots of examples, right? From a house to an abandoned building, to a hospital, to a religious structure, to a health clinic, right? They're all, if you look in the news, you can find all kinds of examples leading to more and more nefarious choices in that. How do we consider the tunnel separate from the structure? Or is that one military objective? Does it matter if it's dug from that structure? What if it reappears in a structure? Is that one also part of the same military objective? What if it transits underneath things? Because a tunnel is going to transit underneath a lot of things. So how do we break that out? This links into a question that is currently being discussed, I think, in some of the discourse, which is when you have some type of large structure, what is the separability of a military objective? If you have an apartment building and the enemy forces have a command post in one apartment within that apartment building, is the apartment the military objective or the whole building? In my sense, from many debates on this, the answer is it depends. Depends on how big the building, how hard it is to separate it, etc. I think that is then going to be the same question sometimes in spades when it comes to tunnels. I know, I didn't mean to make that pun, but since we use spades to dig, yeah, couldn't help it. What about the idea that you can't look at a town as one military objective versus a set of individual military objectives? Does it make sense when the town is riddled with tunnels? When essentially the town is like a Potemkin village on top of a military tunnel complex? Is that actually going to still make sense? All of these questions, right, I've put them from the perspective of how do you identify the military objective, but now put civilians in and around that whole town. And wow, those questions just got a whole lot harder. So let me throw out some of the questions that deal with civilians, and that's proportionality and precautions. And I'm just going to throw some of these out there because I know that Sasha is going to talk a lot about some of the how you assess the information in some of these questions. But for proportionality, right, we've got two components, both of which can present challenges: military advantage and civilian harm. Again, this question of information is essential and potentially fatal in some respects for trying to do this analysis. How do you judge the military advantage of one tunnel versus another? Is it whether it crosses the border? Is it the distance from the border? Is it what it's under? Is it whether it's part of a broader network? The size of the tunnel, whether it has electricity running through it, whether you can drive a motorcycle through it, whether it has different nooks to store weapons, and how would you necessarily know all of those things, right? And when we think about some of the questions, right, you do need to know the value of what you're going to gain from attacking a target in some manner, right? You don't know it like this one's a 6, you know, it's not a number, but we still need to understand. What about civilian harm? Right? We have lots and lots of really interesting tools now, the collateral damage estimation methodology and all these things for trying to figure out what happens when you blow something up with a certain kind of weapon, what's the blast radius, where are the civilians, what's going to happen, and so on and so forth. Well, what if you don't know whether or not they're in the tunnel? What's your tool for figuring out the probability of civilians being in a tunnel? You're in a town, you're in an urban area, you have to presume in some way that people are seeking shelter and perhaps they view a tunnel as a form of shelter. But you don't necessarily know unless you go down and look. So how do you know? What should be your starting point? Because proportionality requires that you gather information. It doesn't require perfect information. It's a decision at the time of the attack based on reasonably available information. Is any information from a tunnel reasonably available? Do we have to reconsider our concept of reasonably available? I'm not suggesting that we should say, oh, I can't possibly find out. Let's just go. That's not the right answer. But the right answer also can't be, I have no way to know if civilians are in there, so I can't do anything. We have to work our way in from those two boundaries. Another really tricky proportionality question is, how many of the follow-on effects and which ones do we consider, right? This is part of a huge debate. Are reverberating effects considered? But what about in a tunnel? Right? When you destroy a tunnel, are you going to collapse the buildings above it? How would you figure that out without having some structural knowledge of the tunnel or the building? And last, in my last second or two, precautions. Right? When we think about the precautions, again, they all depend on some kind of information. Verify the target's a lawful military objective. Choose the means and methods of attack to minimize harm to civilians. We need to know something. Let me throw one out. What about effective advance warning? How do you warn people who are in a tunnel? You're not likely to go like open up the manhole cover. Hello, just want to let you know, bad stuff coming down. Right? It's tricky. How do you issue a warning? Do we simply say, I guess there's no way to give an effective advance warning? I'll leave it to you all to figure out about defending parties' precautions, because I think that's another interesting question, but I'm out of time. So I'll leave that for question time. Thank you.
Thank you very